So what the background to this was an interesting point that came up, and I just tried to draw in quite a lot of different threads into this story. Unfortunately, it's got nothing to do with the old East India projects that we did, but the main thing that came up was the influence of the East India Company is still being felt, and I'm going to talk more about that. And what I tried to do was to try and weave through two things. One is what the East India Company did, and then how did it flow through the British Raj? How did the Indians actually, well, in a way, revolted against the British Raj? And I've tried to weave in my own story within this particular narrative. And it was quite interesting because this brought my own personal history alive. And usually you see history as a stream that is sort of, flowing through pretty interestingly. But once you start boiling it down to an individual person, it gets extremely complicated, as you'll see. So I'm going to talk a bit about my personal journey, and of course my ancestors as well. I'm going to talk about what gave rise to the revolutionaries, and there's a bit of a background to this. Call it revolutionaries or the terrorists, and I'll talk a bit more about that. And then you had sort of, the phases of the revolution that happened in Bengal, and then some final thoughts. So let's start. So here's a bit about my family. As you can see from the top, this is the org chart. And it goes back to about 15 generations. I have no idea whether this is accurate or not, but this is something that has been passed down history. There's absolutely no proof of anybody around here on the left-hand side that you can see. No proof, nothing, no documentation, nothing. But there have been sort of, a version of this family tree has been passed down. So we start having some kind of evidence starting from my great-grandfather, and then you can see he had 3 sons, and again, daughters weren't mentioned. So let's not get into all that trouble of worrying about daughters. So family trees were only, as you can see on the left-hand side, males. It's only when you start coming down to the last century that the female names started to appear. That's my grandfather sitting in the middle, and this was in Dhaka in 1942, and with my grandmother and some of the kids. And then I'll go a bit deeper into that, and then they moved around a bit, and then they landed in India, in Jabalpur. There's my dad over there. There's my dad again over there. Here's my grandfather, my grandmother, and my uncle. They'll come up in the story again. So this is what we put together. My grandfather traveled around a bit, and we've got 4 volumes of his letters that he exchanged with my grandmother. And some of them are really fruity. Seriously fruity. That's for another project. There was another one. My grandfather got married off, and I'll talk about my great-grandfather. And my great-grandfather's, there's a sheet of paper that's the only existing document of his time, where he noted down the budgets and details of what all he had to buy and how much did he pay for my grandfather's wedding. But again, that's for another project. So that's a bit of a background. So if I try and trace this back, this is where the funny part is. So for some reason, whenever I talk to the older generations, they all keep on mentioning that my ancestors came from Georgia. I have absolutely no clue why Georgia is mentioned, but the only thing that I can think about is that Georgia and the Caspian area actually has got a very long history of Indian spice trade. So that could be the only link that I can think about, but there's nothing else. There's also quite a lot of my ancestors who were in Burma. So if I have to say it, I'm kind of Burmese descended. Who knows? But be that as it may, both my maternal as well as my paternal side, they all ended up in Dhaka. Now this is where it starts getting quite interesting. My paternal great-grandfather, Kunjammohan Dasgupta, he was a jailer in Bihar. He actually worked for the British government, and he was a jailer. He ran a jail. Nothing survives other than stories of how he had to imprison dacoits and thugs and people like that. And obviously he was a very well-to-do man, because he spent quite a lot of money on my grandfather's wedding. My paternal grandfather, Shashank Dasgupta, he was a headmaster in a school. He did a double MA at the back end of last century, which is pretty heavy duty at that time. And I'll come to this teaching thing again. My grandmother, she was a zamindar's daughter from the Barisal district. Her connection with this story, she was a tiny woman, absolutely tiny, but she punched out 18 kids, out of which a fair few survived, and she ruled the entire clan with a rod of iron. And she wrote very fruity stories and letters. Just before she left, and I'll talk a bit more about this, you had Lakshmi Sehgal, who was wandering around Dhaka trying to raise money for, revolutionary pieces, and she literally took every piece of jewelry that she had in her house and gifted it away. What else? My uncle, Ajit Dasgupta, he was born in 1924, and he got involved in revolutionary activities. And then the CID got after him, a file was opened, and then he was sent to Calcutta from Dhaka. My father also has a small connection. He met Subhash Bose while he was in house arrest. And this is the house from which, for people who know a bit about the Subhash Bose history, he escaped from there. Anyway, he was a tiny tot at that time, but he used a pen which Subhash Bose gave it to him. Unfortunately, there's no sign of that pen, but there you go. My maternal great-grandfather was a veterinary doctor who was trained in Calcutta. He moved to Allahabad. His parents were from Kumila in Bangladesh. My maternal grandfather wanted to join the British Army. He worked in Slazenzers, it's a British firm, and he wanted to be a British Army officer, and he was a very big, imposing man. He wanted to become a cavalry officer, so he went through the training, everything. And in 1940, as you can imagine, this was in the height of the World War. And he was just waiting for his call-up papers. And his mother kept on hiding those letters. Those call-up letters that used to come to pull him up, to call him to the front. So he never did that, and that's something I knew him. He was, I spoke to him quite a lot. That was a huge impact on him. He really wanted to become a cavalry officer. And he was going to be posted in Singapore. So in a way, what his mother did was right, because as you know, Singapore it surrendered, but there is a kind of a hypothetical link. If he had gone over there, he could have joined the Indian National Army, because a very large number of Indian prisoners of war from Malaya and Singapore ended up in the INA. So there's also that hypothetical link there. And then because of my uncle who got involved in revolutionary activities, my grandmother, who was heavily pregnant, they literally jumped into a bullock cart, and there were quite a lot of riots at the time. And then they went and hid in a tiny village in the depths of western Nepal, where my grandfather became a headmaster, and he stayed there till 1947, once India won independence. Then he moved down to Jabalpur, and that's where my father got married to my mother, who's from Allahabad. And I was born there in Bhopal, in Jabalpur. From Jabalpur, went to Bhopal, Bhopal to Indore. And from there, in 92, I came to Manchester to study. And then from there to here. And that's where I'm trying to close the loop. I wanted to join the Indian Navy. Then once I came over here, I studied terrorism. And I worked as a British civil servant. So kind of closing the loop to my great-grandfather, who was also a British civil servant, because he was a jailer. My children are British citizens. And again, that also closes the loop, because my ancestors, as far as when they were ruled by the British, were also British citizens. So I just found this tracing back and going back quite interesting. And I'm going to start talking a bit more about my uncle, because that's where it starts overlapping with the terrorist piece. So let's talk about the terrorists or the revolutionaries. So why am I calling it as Bhodrolok Terrorists? Bhodrolok is a peculiarly Bengali term, which stands for gentleman. But not sort of in the English pure sense. It's a question of being very civilized, you're very highly educated, stuff like that. And the second piece that comes up is the terrorist piece. Obviously, at that time, the word terrorism was not used, even though there was the French Revolution, the terrorism directorate connection as well, which again pops up quite frequently. But at that time, the Britishers used to call them as dacoits. But this was also challenging, again, which I'll talk about in a later. So what's the connection with the East India Company? And this is where you start getting into how history has got such long repercussions. So we are talking about 1935, right? This is way after the first voyages. This is way after Tipu Sultan was taken over. This is way after the infrastructure was laid. Now you have got the situation that you have got the East India Company, a corporate company, which now owns a very large part of India. And now their thoughts are going to, how the hell am I going to govern this? How am I going to manage this? And that's where this very famous minute on education, if you folks have a chance, do look it up. It's, I think, worthwhile for everybody to read, because I think that minute has had more influence on human history than pretty much anything else. In one piece, he talks about, we must at present do our best to form a class which may be interpreters between us and the millions who we govern, a class of persons Indian in blood and color, but English in tastes, opinions, morals, and in intellect. So literally, they tried to create a set of people who would help them manage the country. That minute, which Macaulay wrote, led to Bentinck's English Education Act 1935, which started to establish the entire system of English language education, which still exists. Pretty much in most of the Commonwealth, pretty much in the UK of course, the USA, anywhere that you have got this particular system, you can trace it back to this particular act. The other key thing to remember is that Macaulay, who by all means, if you read his background, was a polymath. This chap also was a very, very smart lawyer, and this is the other piece that is absolutely crucial when you're talking about terrorism or revolutions. And this is part of the British psyche, and this is where you will see this happening right now, is that people need to not only get educated, but they also need to be controlled. And to control, you need to have the stick. And that is, he created the Penile Code as a leading member of the Law Commission, and the Indian Penal Code of 1860 was established. And this particular work that Macaulay put in actually drives a very large proportion of what our lives is about and our children's lives. And I'm not just talking about the fact that we are here in London. We could be anywhere in the Commonwealth or outside, but what the East India Company did is impacting a huge number of people. So, what happened? Now, what happened was, this is in 1935. Now, you see, you have now got 1835, sorry. Now, you have got the law that has been set up. People have started to come in. People have started to get trained. These teachers and headmasters and the educational system and colleges, these have started to get set up. So now, let me leap forward towards the end of the 1890s, 1900s. Now they had what I would call as a critical mass of people who were out there, like my grandfather, who was the headmaster of his school. They had gone through, he had a double MA. He knew what had to be taught, They were using the books that the Britishers had written. This is where it's starting to come out. But as usual, it's once the second generation starts to come through the pipe, they start questioning the old received wisdom. So what I'm talking about here is the 50 years, roughly about 50 years from 1900 to 1947. So once they started to get educated, this is where the problem started to happen. The first is they started to demand full independence instead of a dominion status or a home rule. Their education exposed them to American, Irish, French, and Italian revolutions. Garibaldi's work. They heard about Burke. They heard about Thomas Paine. I think you mentioned Stuart Mill. Mill's work. They were exposed to all these things that other countries had done. And this is where the crucial piece comes in, which is the connection with the Bhodrolok, the educated class. Their weapons were not just the bombs and pistols, but their education and their writings, which I'll come back again. The other thing was that they belonged to a very elite group, usually Brahmins or Kayasth. And strangely enough, no Muslims. In all my analysis for this particular time, I couldn't find any. But again, it could be a self-selection problem as well. And this started to confuse the local British Raj officials hugely. Because previously, as you can appreciate, they had criminal caste, martial caste, and effeminate castes. So the British Army would recruit people from the martial caste, the Punjabis, the Marathas. These were the people who were supposed to be the soldierly, manly classes. Then you had lower caste people who were the criminal classes, the gypsies, if you will. If you want to find out why the gypsies have been oppressed for so long, that's another connection. And Bengalis were considered to be effeminate. Oh, they're useless. Now the entire infrastructure of law and education that was there was channeled towards getting these high caste Bengali Hindu people into becoming their professional people, their accountants, their lawyers, their teachers, their surveyors, their geographers, these people who would help manage the country. But as soon as these people started to read about what happened to the American, Irish, French, and Italian revolutions, along with, of course, the Russian one, but the Russian one for some reason didn't come up that well at this point. It did come up later on. But they started to learn about bombs and pistols. And the British officialdom just couldn't handle the fact that something that they had thought about, that the Bengalis were very effeminate, have suddenly become, they have started to become violence. Doesn't compute. These were mostly highly educated, attended colleges and universities. My uncle, he joined the university, but then he dropped out because he said this is more fun. And you will see some examples I will give. Not almost, everybody was educated. They were school at least and in universities, predominantly Hindu, both men and a surprisingly large number of women. It was quite extraordinary. I was very surprised to see the number of women, and I'll go slightly deeper into that later on. And strange connections start popping up. They started to create these secret societies. And strangely enough, for people who do have a bit of a religious background, these people were influenced by Ramakrishnan, Swami Vivekananda, Sri Aurobindo. I didn't know that Swami Vivekananda's brother, Bhupendranath Datta, and Sri Aurobindo's brother, Barindran Kumar Ghosh, they were jailed. You don't compute that. These guys were religious people. They were talking about religion and Vedanta and meditation. Completely. And their brothers, they were going around throwing bombs. So it's very complex. So the first thing that happened was what I call as the initial heroic incompetent phase. And I'll talk about why I bring in the incompetence and why heroic. So look at this email that, not email, sorry, obviously they don't have email. Letter. There is a serious risk unless the movement in Bengal is checked that the political dacoits and the professional dacoits in other provinces may join hands, and that the bad example set by these men in an unwarlike province like Bengal may, if it continues, lead to imitation in provinces inhabited by the fighting races, where the results could be even more disastrous. What you have to remember is the number of British people in India was minuscule. Absolutely minuscule. They relied on this educated class of middle class people to run India. And if these people started to create problems, then obviously, hence this memo. World War I broke out. This is where the Russian Revolution pieces started to come out. They understood absolutely. Trotsky, Lenin, Marx, they all started to come out. It's at this point in time, the Swadeshi movement also broke out. You know, we were talking about muslin cloth, we were talking about the production, and this is where people started to realize that there is an economic component to this rule as well. And the Swadeshi movement started to drive, guys, let's not just buy stuff from England, but let's try and buy stuff from which is made in India. Bengal was reunited. Official conversations started to happen as to how Indians will have political representation, dominion, or home rule. These are where formal committees started to get formed. So you can appreciate that back here in London, people started to realize that this current situation can't go on. At the same time, and this is where I point out that the Criminal Law Amendment Act 1908 and Defence of India Act 1915, these started to come up trying to control these Bhodroloks, these Bengalis who were starting to get very uppity and start chucking bombs and shooting people. And this is a clear frame of reference that pretty much every country, even now, adopts to deal with terrorism. You just can't take out suspected terrorists and shoot them, although I'll talk about that in a moment. They have tried to do that, but to handle terrorism, they try and handle it within existing laws. Right. So here are some examples that I've got. There were quite a lot of these sort of issues that happened or incidents that happened in the first part of the half a century that I'm talking about. So the Alipur conspiracy case, Midnapur conspiracy case, Howrah gang case, etc., etc. Let me talk about the incompetence piece. They were really, really incompetent. I'm sorry to say that, but that was the case. Even though several people were sent over to Paris to learn how to make bombs, but regretfully, at that time they would use gunpowder. Now, people who have got a bit of knowledge about gunpowder, if you don't treat it properly, it separates out. You were talking about saltpeter, right? It separates out. So you need to be very careful with gunpowder. And if you start making a bomb with that and you keep it for a long time, or if you shake it too much, then the chemicals separate and it doesn't explode. Look at what they tried to do with the Bengal governor, Andrew Fraser. They tried to kill him. They tried to kill him again with a pistol. It jammed. They tried to blow up his train twice. Now, because of the sheer amount of terrorism in Bengal, the Britishers would try and get onto the train and go to Shimla, one, to get away from the heat, but also to distance themselves from the terrorists. So these guys said, oh, you're going to go there? I'm going to try and blow up your train. Didn't quite work. The last time the bomb did explode, but the chap didn't die. Then another one was with Douglas Kingford, who was the chief magistrate of Presidency Court. He was first given a book bomb. The idea was that they took a book, a very fat legal book, they carved a hole in it, they put in a bomb, and they tied a string to the top cover, and they packaged it up, and they gave it to Douglas Kingford. Unfortunately, he took it and he said, oh, come on, another bloody legal book, I don't want to read it. He put it on the shelf, right? And then he moved house. So all his books got packed away. And by this time, the chemicals separated, so anyway, the book bomb didn't happen. Then again, you had a chance to throw a bomb in his carriage. Unfortunately, it was Twilight, and there were two carriages that came out identical. They missed the first one, where Kingford was. They managed to throw the bomb into the second carriage, where there were two completely innocent women, and killed them. So this is where Khudiram Bose comes in. That's a young man. This is after his arrest. Aurobindo Ghosh, which I said, so people who know about Pondicherry and stuff, they have done, he was the ringleader and he ran this Jugantar group. This is a photo of the Alipur Sessions Court in 1997, but this is where the trial happened. And this is Khudiram Bose. He can technically be called as the first Bhodrolok martyr. And this is where it started to become quite interesting. Look at him. 18 years old. He had just finished school. Young fellow. He's younger than my son. His son's 23. They targeted Kingsford because he was the prosecutor and he went after a newspaper. He also ordered corporal punishment to quite a lot of people who were protesting. So they would just catch somebody and cane the hell out of him. Anyway, good target of opportunity. Look what Statesman said on the 2nd of May. The railway station was crowded to see the boy, a mere boy of 18 or 19 years of age who looked quite determined. He came out of a first-class compartment and walked all the way to the phaeton. Phaeton is the carriage. Kept for him outside. Like a cheerful boy who knows no anxiety, on taking his seat, the boy lustily cried out, Vande Mataram. That's him again. That's how he was dressed. Now, he was what I would call as the first publicity martyr, publicity terrorist. We think right now people start doing, with all the terrorism that's going on, the publicity is right now. Oh, no. You can see on the left, this was printed, and this was circulated across the country. And this is color printing, and he's smiling, and of course the face doesn't match, but you can see him wearing the the prison uniform, and he became literally the poster child. Now, despite the fact that he had killed 2 innocent people, you had a very large number of quite a lot of Indian nationalists who had been trained as British lawyers. They all came over here and took the bar. They all went back and started to defend him. Even though they would say we are not for violence, but they would defend him. So you can start seeing how the question of terrorism started to get intermixed with revolutionaries. As somebody says, one person's freedom fighter is your other person's terrorism. You can see how this confusion starts to come through. So the next thing that happened was, once all this happened, and I'm going to talk about how did the Britishers try to control it. The problem was that it was extraordinarily difficult to prosecute these people. Extremely difficult, almost impossible. Despite them capturing almost about 300 to 400 terrorists, not even a single person was able to meet the levels of proof for the original sentence that the prosecutors asked. Most of them were asked to be given the death sentence. Extremely few actually got it. So what happened was that they put together this act, the Anarchical and Revolutionary Crimes Act of 1919, Rowlatt Act. Now you see what's happening over here. What did it say? What did it say? Control over the press, arrest without warrant, indefinite detention without trial, juryless in-camera trials for proscribed political acts, accused were denied the right to know the accusers and the evidence used in the trial. And whilst I was reading this, you had somebody try and steal the Magna Carta, where the whole concept of habeas corpus, that you cannot be imprisoned without due process, etc., etc. This is the place where it started. And these are the people who went in and tried to implement this simply because the legal structure was not sufficient to manage these terrorists. This obviously created a big hoo-ha. People absolutely went berserk. Now this is where the education piece comes in as well. The liberal education that was being provided by the British to all these people was all about legal rights, liberalism. And you can't go about having something like this. And this particular act directly led to the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. And then, after all that they repealed it. But it came back. It came back. I'll talk about that more. This also gave rise to the non-cooperation movement, the civil disobedience movement. Gandhi and Congress's non-violence creed started to come up, and sort of, just as a reaction to these are what the terrorists are doing, but we want to protest against that. Many more cases were there. You had the infamous Bengal Criminal Law Amendment Acts that started to put in. Even though the act was repealed in 1922, quite a lot of these provisions came back. And you had people like Motilal Nehru and Muhammad Ali Jinnah who really, really protested against it. And those are classics of liberal argument, fighting against an overbearing state. You had a network of jails and detention centers. This is the time where Chittaranjan Das, Bipin Chandrapal, the Bose brothers, M.N. Roy, J.M. Sengupta, all these people came up. And interestingly, this is where, on a third track, people were starting to talk about how India is going to get independence. But as you can see from the last line, the Earl of Birkenhead, Secretary of State for India, he wasn't that confident that India will be able to get independence. And these people were absolutely chucked into jail, huge amounts. But the problem was that the jails were set up for the criminal classes, the dacoits, the thieves, the robbers. Now you have got a set of people who are gentlemen. They are Bhodrolok, they are educated, right? They write letters. They protest, they go on hunger strike. So the British were simply not able to handle it. So they created a completely separate set of jails and detention centers to handle them. And somebody had a brainwave, oh, these guys are all coming from Bengal, so let's get the detention centers as far away as possible. So they set them up in a place like, for example, Deoli in Rajasthan. But then they were treated very differently. They were given allowances, actual money, books, papers, food, clothing, servants, washing, etc., etc. A clerk was hired at the Imperial Library in Calcutta to provide books to the detainees. Now, these detainees were very good at writing. They were very good at education. They protested. They said, you're not feeding us with the food that we are accustomed to. Guess what? Food was sent all the way from Bengal to Rajasthan and Punjab. Here's an example of what came through in June 1932. Eggplant, tomatoes, pumpkin, jinga, ripe mangoes, fish 4 times a week. 4 times a week. You're kidding me. Mutton, eggs, milk, pomegranate. This is what was fed to these political prisoners. And people complain about it. What the hell? I mean, we are giving them allowances while the civil service salaries were being cut. You're kidding me. As you can see, this telegram to the Secretary of State from the Secretary of Government of India Home Department was complaining about, yeah, these guys are just enjoying themselves, having fun, etc., etc. The other thing was that the caste issues were huge over here. These were all, as I said, Brahmins or Vedas or castes. They would rely on the lower caste to cook food for them. Obviously, quite a lot of the criminal classes were from different sort of, OBCs, the other backward classes, scheduled classes, Dalits, Muslims, any other kind of sort of, and these guys would be kept completely separate from them. And there was a huge concept around that, we are cerebral, we are intellectual, we are gentlemen, so we are supposed to be treated. It's quite interesting. On one side, you're talking about liberalism, you're fighting against everybody, and at the same time, the same very people are stamping on a lower caste person. They're stamping on somebody who's eating something else. Ridiculous. Now, once they put in all these people into jail, the number of terrorist events reduced a bit, which gave a kind of credence back to here. And Mr. Ben, who was at that time, and you know Mr. Ben, who's right now in politics as well, so it's a good political family. The Liberal administration at that time started to release people. And then, from 1932 independence, you had an absolute spike of terrorist events. Absolute spike. They started to understand more about bombs. They started to go after robberies a bit more. They started to attack post offices and banks and places where there were sort of, cash flying around. Quite a lot of senior people started to get killed. Quite a lot. Huge numbers. Not just the senior people, but also the informers and the people, collaborators, and this is quite frequently that happens in terrorist events. One example was the assassination of Inspector Khan Bahadur Ashanullah, who prosecuted the Chittagong Armory raiders. After that, he was assassinated. Nobody knows who killed him. But then as soon as he got assassinated, communal riots broke out. So the idea was initially that it was a Hindu versus Muslim thing. But then a court of inquiry was set up, and then they found out that it was actually the Chittagong police who did the rioting. Just to show how complicated the situation is becoming. And this is where, during this particular period, Subhash Chandra Bose started to become the president of the Indian National Congress. World War II begins. Defense of India Rules Act of 1939 began. And this is where a huge number of people were chucked back into jail. These acts were the basis by which the British government was controlling people. Besides the Bengalis, they were also throwing in people who were from China, from Japan, etc., etc. But this mass of people, and this is where the Indian National Army trials happened in 1945 and 46, which led to mutinies in Bombay, etc., etc. And that was perhaps one of the last straws. Because of the sheer number of terrorist events that were happening, and the British Army actually started to mutiny itself. And of course, the National Army trials absolutely killed any kind of what I would call as liberal perspective behind actually holding them. And that led to independence in 1947. Now, a couple of very quick things. I talked about women terrorists. I was so surprised. I didn't expect this to happen. But while reading, I came across about 18 women who were, I'm not talking about people who were sympathizers. My grandmother was one. My grandmother gifted basically all the family wealth to Nantara Sehgal. So she would be what would be called in modern day parlance as a terrorist sympathizer. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about people who actually did something. And it was extraordinary. You're talking about, I mean, let's not get excited. They weren't, again, very effective, as in they would be firing so many bullets, but they wouldn't hit. That's besides the point. So you got Shanti Ghosh, Suniti Chaudhary, you've got, what's this lady's name? Preeti Lata Wadekar. She attacked a sporting club. And when she was surrounded, she actually ate cyanide. And that was quite common. Because of the torture that frequently used to happen, very large number of people, when they used to get arrested or cornered, would either shoot themselves or they would take cyanide. They used to do quite a lot of other things as well. They would actually, we are talking about 1930s and 1940s, they would, without being married, go out with another colleague and go live together as husband and wife just to do reconnaissance missions. You can just imagine the amount of cultural conditioning that they had to break to actually go out and live in a hotel room and do this. Not just that, as I've given you examples, we're talking about people who learned martial arts, they learned how to throw bombs, and they learned how to use pistols. Fascinating. The last point that I want to make before I sum up is that the key thing that happened, and we were talking about history, Shameen, is that these people were all educated. They started to take the education initiative away from the British originated history, the East India Company history, the history that the Britishers were writing about India. You know, you were talking about, you gave an example of what Mill wrote about, you know, they were bad, they didn't look after their women, etc., etc. But what they did was that what these terrorists, because they were so educated and they had books and pens and papers and they were put into fairly salubrious conditions in the detention camps, this is where an absolute outpouring of intellectual rigor came out. This is the period where Jawaharlal Nehru wrote his books. If you get a chance to read his letters to Indira Gandhi, please do. Anybody who's got a daughter will appreciate that. So these people started to write India's history as viewed by Indians. And this, in my view, was the crucial thing that tipped the balance, because it was just not the top people who started to get it, they started to percolate down to the lower, lesser educated people as well. it wasn't the bombs. It was not the shots. They didn't work anyway in the first place, or mostly. It was this. It was this absolute outpouring of newspaper articles, books, pamphlets, biographies, autobiographies. This is what came out. And then they wrote about economic oppression. The Indigo pieces that we're talking about, the dyeing piece, the weavers. They were talking about chastity of mothers and sisters. In a flip side of, you were talking about Raja Ram Mohan Roy protecting women from sati, they took that same example and they turned it around and say, look at what the Britishers are doing. They're taking the chastity away from our women. Not something that people like to hear, but they did this. Poems about freedom and self-sacrifice, mystical. I mean, this could be a Bengali thing, but quite a lot of these books and poems and songs were hugely mystical. There we go. Quite a lot of them wrote about revolutionary and terrorist manuals as to how to rob, how to shoot, how to make bombs, so on and so forth. Here's an example. I don't know if people have heard this song. I've got the link up there. I thought I could play this. But this was written at the time of the late, I think about 1880s or 1890s, where the religious Swamis actually revolted. And Ananda Math was written at that time. This is a very controversial song. But remember, I told you about how Khudiram Bose was going to his gallows and said Vande Mataram? This is the song. And again, the power of this song, and once Rabindranath Tagore translated it from Bengali to English and to Hindi, it just caught fire. Again, showing the power of education. Anyway, final thoughts. Taking it back, we really learn from history despite it being a vast early warning system.
Are you going to? Are we not listening to Vande Mataram?
I'm not sure whether we can, but I'll try and do that. When you look at how we are currently going through a terrorist problem here. We went through another one with Northern Ireland. We learned about this day in, day out, that terrorism has been happening for a very long period of time. But we don't learn. That's why, personally speaking, I don't like foreign entanglements. These things happen. Second is, history repeats itself. These things keep on coming back. Look at the London bombers. Highly educated people. School teacher. Why would he do that? Why would my uncle, an educated person, why would he suddenly start going around and becoming a revolutionary? Why would my grandmother pick up the money at home and give it over to what legally was a terrorist incident? The third thing that I figured out was the decisions we take today will reverberate down centuries. And that's why whenever you're talking about laws, and whenever you're talking about defense or fighting or wars, as a kind of amateur historian, I have learned, don't. Because what you do today is going to hit you 10, 20, 100, 200, 300 years later on. But the last thing, personally, once I had this particular history laid out and then started to introduce my personal history, it brought it alive for me. Previously, it was dry. It was a story about big men, big explosions, big dates. But then I could see, my father actually went to meet Subhash Chandra Bose, holding his hand. He was, I think, 4 or 5 years of age. And that brought it alive. Anyway, I'll stop now.
Any questions?
So just an observation about repeating history. At the same time when the British were getting indications from India that they may well lose their control over it, at exactly the same moment in time in the 1930s, they were playing their forays with Lawrence of Arabia in the Middle East, creating Saudi Arabia, and the exact same reactions we're seeing now as the British were seeing back in the 30s in India. So it wasn't even an issue of just history repeating itself. It was happening in parallel.
Yes.
And not learning lessons from one place and putting it on the other. But my question actually is, in terms of your family, half of it have worked for the British in different guises, the other half have worked against.
Yeah.
Which part of your family are you most proud of?
That's a good question. I have a problem with the word proud. I'll explain this, explain why. Again, as a historian, I've heard too many statements like, I'm proud of my country, I'm proud of my religion. For me, pride is not something that I would like to be. So if I have to say something, I'm not proud of any part of it. Right? I gave you my own example. Right? I was in the military, and I was a British civil servant as well. So how do I divide myself? What I'm trying to say is, history is very, very complicated. In my family itself, I had both sides. It's again the Tebbit test. If England is playing against India, who do I support? I found out the answer to that question. Whoever is winning. Right? Now it's a facile answer, because whatever I say is not going to be right. So I'm afraid I don't have a good answer to you, but I'm not proud of any of these things, because I realize that as soon as you become prideful, your ears and eyes close.
Any more?
It's quite an elite history of terrorism that you've described. You know, you talk about Macaulay's memorandum, and what he was trying to do was essentially create a class of brown Sahuds. And there's an argument that really the brown Sahuds just wanted to replace the white Sahuds in terms of you know, Indian independence. So where do the Muslims, where do the poorer people in India to come into this narrative?
That's a good question. Look, I mean, post-independence, the Indian government used exactly the same laws and techniques to deal with their terrorist problems. Exactly the same thing, which is highly ironical. Right, that's the first thing. Second thing is, as far as I know, especially in Bengal, the Muslim population were not that well educated. If you look at the zamindars, they were, I would say, and I'm guessing, 60 to 70% of them were Hindus. My grandmother was the youngest daughter of a zamindar as well. So they were never exposed to this. They were just considered to be sort of, you know, cattle fodder or just part of the masses, great unwashed herd, if you will. It's only once the sort of, you know, home rule started to happen, the Haq ministry took over, then they started to establish village schools, etc., etc. And that's where these people started to get educated and come into the body politic. But the timing that I'm talking about, they weren't there at all. At all. But on the flip side, this is where songs like Vande Mataram and pamphlets and postcards were so powerful. Because the visualization of Khudiram Bose and the song, you don't have to be educated. You can sing a song. So that's how they were brought in. But it took long for them to come through. Does that answer your question? I don't think it did.
Okay, could you
kindly elaborate a little more on the historical methodology that you're using? Because you brought in the personal history at the very onset. And then there were like very big, broad events from Indian history, which sometimes appeared very decontextualized to me. And you are using the word terrorism and terrorist. It's a very loaded word. Why aren't we using a word militant? Are our terrorists all over the world same and a very uniform category? Is it same in Kashmir? Is it same in Somalia? And is Khudram Bose same as all of them?
That's a good question. Again, let's put it this way. I did research terrorism, right, from King's. And when I did it, I found out there was somewhere around about, just in English, somewhere around about 600 various definitions of what terrorism is. So the reason why I'm using terrorism, revolutionaries, and I'm not using militant because that word was not used during this time. Either you would be used as, you would be called as a political prisoner, or you would be called as a revolutionary, or before that, they didn't even use the word terrorism, they were called as dacoits.
But as a historian, you do have a personal agency when you're doing research, right? You're bringing in your personal archive into this big, broad research, which is very interesting, the connections that you're drawing. So as a historian, as a researcher, you have a personal agency to come up with a new vocabulary when you're looking at this phenomenon altogether.
You're absolutely right. I mean, that's why I tried to give you an example of my grandmother.
It's fascinating. I mean,
right?
She's giving away her jewels.
Right. So she, from the British perspective, is what? A terrorist sympathizer, a terrorist funder. Because remember, at that point in time, the legal structure that governed her behavior was the British legal system.
But that is my question. Are you buying into that same
Yeah,
sort of
no,
vocabulary?
I-
Are you buying into that narrative? Are you completely denying the fact that this is happening in colonial India and it is a struggle towards independence?
No. What I'm trying to say is that the definitions changed over time. And when you look back, you have to evaluate the actions that people did at that time with reference to the structures that were then extant.
But then you're buying into the hierarchy therein. You are giving colonialism, the colonial administration, the upper hand with respect to the struggle. A history that has erased struggles of people, of Muslims, of Adivasis, of tribes, of the northeastern part of India, and that is why there is so much of militant activities going on in the whole of South Asia. It is a repercussion of colonialism and nothing else.
I get it, but what I'm trying to say is,
And in fact, in that vein, it's the colonialism that's the terrorism. You are literally trying to impose a whole new stance to it that goes against what history is. And it's galling to hear that, actually. It's depressing and galling to hear it from, well, supposedly
I
a
wonder if we could have a
historian.
more interesting conversation than the definition of terrorism one way or the other. Because Jesus was a terrorist and so was the Roman emperor who oppressed him, but there we go.
what I'm trying to say is,
If Indian militant Hindu nationalism in India considers Muhammad as a terrorist, do you buy into that narrative? Do you not think rationally?
No, but the conversation is a language form that we're trying to work with. If you start departing from the language form itself, then there can be no conversation.
And you're bringing in a novel like Anand Martu, and it is that song Vande Mataram, which the yogis, the sannyasis from that novel are using,
Yes.
and they are a militant group of people, and Bankim Chandra was criticized heavily
Yes.
for introducing Hindu nationalism, Hindu militant nationalism through this novel. And current government, the current BJP, RSS-led government in India is using the same rhetoric, same narrative. So it's very different how one text gets used over time.
I get it, but
Yeah,
this is
it's
the...
not fossilized.
No, I never said that. What I'm trying to say is, what would cause people who were communists in that period of time sing that song?
Communists were singing that song. If you look at the history of the Indian People's Theatre Association from the 1940s onwards, it is not that communists were only buying into the Marxist doctrine and they were not. The faction within CPI was whether they would support the Congress or not.
Yes.
And that led to the faction, CPI and CPIM and CPIML.
What I'm trying to say is that at that period of time, despite the objections against this song, these guys were singing that song. And they thought of themselves as nationalists, even without having that Hindu nationalist piece that you're talking about.
That is being used now in the current context,
I get it.
which
But
is being pitted against the Muslims, and that's why every day you get to read about mob lynchings and killings and how the minority is being treated.
so what
It
I
has
was
got greater repercussions from this whole narrative that we are churning and we are continuing to churn.
So what I'm trying to get to is that to answer your question, I was trying to bring my ancestors alive at that point in time when they were faced with the scenarios at that point in time. I'm not talking about right now.
Using the same narrative, would you not describe the British as the terrorists within that context?
Of course.
How would you separate that element of it? If you're using that narrative of the time,
Yes.
people who have done those sort of issues, why were the British not described as terrorists within that context?
I gave you examples. My family protested against that. It's not like they just said it, they acted it out.
Can I come to the basics? You said that your family all rebelled against the British.
Not all.
Some. My three things come more basics. Those who is hungry, he doesn't think of these revolution. You know all these talking about Bengali. I come from I am Bengali as well, but I come from a Muslim family. Do you know that in Fort William, they started Sanskrit college and Hindu college. Aim is to produce interpreter and their pen pusher.
Correct.
And when these people educated, they think apart from being hungry, when they are wealthy, they don't want to be ruled by the British. That's what it is. And you said that there were not many Muslims. There were, do you know, probably in those days, in the college, 50 students, there was not a single Muslim.
Yes.
Because they are uneducated.
Yes.
And you know the basic of it, because during Lord Cornwallis, there was a permanent settlement, and Muslims, they are sulking because obviously Hindus find they are ruled by the Muslims, now they are British. That didn't matter, they make a best of it.
The other
So
problem,
that's the way.
the other problem was that from the little that I know, the Muslim intellectuals generally, and I think we had this conversation as well, about the women as well, they corresponded mostly in Farsi,
Yeah,
because that was the court language,
exactly.
right? The connection between Farsi and Urdu, which started to come out from the East India Company Muslim regiments,
Yeah,
right? Unfortunately, that did not develop at that particular point in time, this idea about nationalism. Because that was again targeted towards sort of, the royalty and stuff like that. But I take your point.
so my main point is, unless you are wealthy,
Yes,
you cannot, don't do fight for independence. All Khudiram or
Yes.
your family,
Yes.
when they became from
agreed,
wealthy, they had money,
yes,
comes from Jamindar, they
Yes.
think, oh, only
agreed.
tummy is not this, there is other aspect.
These were all middle class people.
Yeah, exactly,
They had money, they didn't have to worry about it.
yeah.
That's why they had the chance to read, study, sing, act out in plays.
And you know Rabindranath's family originally was a Pujari Brahman. They used to just conduct things and get very little money. Came from Bangladesh. Then when Calcutta became the capital, they moved there for more business. They became wealthy. They get the prince things and all these things. So ultimately, all comes with money and education.
Yep, agreed.
We're really running